Hi, I'm Paul Brodie. We're in my shop. Mitch is behind the camera, as usual. Thank you. I want to thank all the viewers. We want to thank all the viewers for the coffee. It's much appreciated. We're going to do something today that's a little bit different. I'm not going to make anything. We're going to talk about a motorcycle that I used to own a long time ago. It's called a Vincent. I bought the Vincent when I was 19 years old, and at that point I was the youngest Vincent owner in BC. A quarter of a century later, when I sold my Vincent, I was still the youngest Vincent owner in BC. So that says something about the Vincent Owners Club. They are aging. When I left high school at 18, I started working in a machine shop right away. There was a machinist working there. His name was Chris, and I found out very soon that he owned a couple Vincents. And for me, that was just amazing. I had never known anyone that owned a Vincent. So one day, after I'd been working there for a few months, he came in and he said, over the weekend, you know, there was a Vincent for sale for 50 bucks. And I said, 50 bucks? And he says, yeah, he says, I couldn't start mine. And so I got so frustrated. If someone came by with 50 bucks, I would have sold it. So at that point, I knew that I was hooked on Vincent. So I said, if a Vincent ever comes up, you let me know, okay? So it wasn't that long after that he let me know that there was a Vincent for sale. In 1955, the Vincent factory closed its doors for the final time. So that meant for the Vincent owners, there was no more parts available. What started happening was someone over here made pistons, someone made valves, someone over here made something else. So the parts were being made all over England mostly. But the problem was, it was the quality. It was hit and miss. So in the time that I owned a Vincent, from 74 to 99, when you ordered a part, you never knew if it was going to fit. If you buy a Honda part, it always fits. Have you ever heard of a Honda part that didn't fit? No, you haven't. So there was one owner, this is the story that I recall, he ordered a set of Vincent header pipes, brand new from England. And so on a Saturday morning, he went outside. It was sunny, and he tried to put the pipes on. And they almost fit, but they wouldn't quite go on. You have to put each of the header pipes into each cylinder. And when it's out of alignment, it doesn't go in. So he tried all morning, and I guess he got pretty frustrated because at lunchtime, he went into his shop. He got a 3-pound hammer and he came out and he put them on the concrete and he beat them flat. And that was the end of his problem. In BC here, where I live, I was a member of the Vincent Owners Club, and everyone was older than me. And because I was making a non-standard Vincent, I was kind of the black sheep. Other people had, you know, maybe they put a different set of forks on off of Norton or something like that, but mostly, they were mostly stock, maybe a larger gas tank. So being the youngest and doing something as outrageous as building something that had very few stock parts. The only stock parts I had really were the motor, and then there was the UFM, that's the universal frame member, the oil tank and the steering head, and a foot peg rubber. That was it. That was all my stock parts. In the 1950s, Vincent was the world's fastest motorcycle, and in their advertising, they would actually say, this is a fact, not a slogan. And I think one of the most iconic photos ever of a Vincent was Raleigh Free on the salt flats in his bathing suit on September 13th, 1948, going 150.13 miles an hour, which is just amazing. You cannot do that now. They will not let you ride your bike in a bathing suit. I bought a Vincent, and the Vincent I bought was a 1950 Black Shadow Series C, which is a desirable motorcycle. When I bought the bike off Dennis Mitchell, we'll introduce him later, I got basically a bunch of parts. And, you know, I got hubs, rusty rims, crankcases, gas tank, oil tank, fork blades, but there was a lot missing. What I found out much later, that my bike or parts had passed hands maybe 4 or 5 times in the year or two previous to me purchasing it. And everyone who owned the box of parts, what they did was to take all the best stuff and then sell the rest. And then I come along five transactions later and I think, great, I've got a Vincent. After I got my Vincent, my box of parts, I started ordering parts, and it wasn't like today because we didn't have, it was 1974, we didn't have email, we didn't have fax even. So what I would do is I would write a letter to England and put it in the mail, and then I would have to wait for a reply. And that took weeks. And then when I finally found out what parts were available and the cost, I'd go to the bank, I'd get out a money order, then I'd mail that to England, then wait another 6 weeks for the parts to come over here. So after about a year, I had most of the parts, I seem to remember, but that's the time I decided that I didn't want to stock Vincent. I wanted to go, I had this thing in my head about vintage road racing. I wanted to go vintage road racing on a Vincent. When I think back on it now, it's kind of absurd, but at the time, it really seemed like the right thing to do. So that's what I did. What was it like to ride my Vincent? Because I did go to California on it and I had a lot of time to think about it. Stressful, that's the one word, because constantly listening for that little engine noise that was out of place. So I could never really relax while I was riding and really enjoy it. I was always listening, constantly listening for unwanted sounds. That was my experience. In 1983, I was living in a house on Fraser Street, and I had a really small shop. You're going to see some photos a little bit later of how small it really was. I had oxy-acetylene, I had a bench, a vise, a light, a hand hacksaw, a hand drill, and that's about it. And I was making a custom motorcycle. So what I'm trying to say to you is that you can do a lot with not much. I didn't have a lathe, but I had a friend. His name was Chris, the same guy that owned the Vincent. So I'd phone him up now and then and say, "Chris, would you mind if I come over and use your lathe?" And he was very obliging. And I had this other friend, Dave. He had a TIG welder and he had a bandsaw. So sometimes I'd go see him as well. And in that combination of having a couple friends with some tools, I made a motorcycle. On the trip to California on the Vincent, I broke down 3 times. I fouled a lot of front cylinder spark plugs. And on the way back, I was at the border heading back into Canada. It started to run on one cylinder, and when I took the engine apart a little bit, it ate another push rod. So I definitely had some problems with that bike. What do I think of the shape of my Vincent? I'm talking about the seat and the tank and all that. So I think now it's a bit hit and miss. I was still learning how to make shapes, and probably still am learning how to make shapes, but I think the bike looked good from some angles, but in other angles, it didn't look so good at all. So it was a learning experience for me. If you don't know what a stock Vincent looks like, this is a pretty good photo of one. You can see it's got the classic lines from the 50s. It's got the hydraulic forks here, and it's basically black. A black shadow was black, a rapide was silver, and polished alloy sometimes. This is a shot I took years ago, and it's just a nice shot of a Vincent motor. Here is Dennis Mitchell. He sold me my bike, my Vincent, back in 1974, and we're still friends. He's thrown a motorcycle shop in Richmond. It was D. Mitchell Sales and Service, and then it became Richmond Honda, I believe. Great guy. That is my sales receipt. I went there, I had $490 and the price was $600, and he let me take all the parts, and I owed him $110. I went back a week later. I drove out to his place in my Austin Mini in a snowstorm. That's how badly I wanted the bike. This photo is the earliest known photo of Vincent. It was taken on a Polaroid camera, you can tell. And I've done some work on it. I've got forks, I've got a headlight, I've got a tachometer, I've got a racing seat, I've got S&W air shocks, but the engine is empty. I haven't started on the engine. I think I got my priorities all ass backwards. So I'm still young. I'm still living at my parents' house. This is out on the street, and you can see that I've even got a steering damper mounted now. I've got a front fender made. I've got McKinney carburetors off a Suzuki 500 two-stroke, which are inappropriate, and empty engine. when I look back, it didn't really make a lot of sense. This is a little bit later, and I've got an engine cover on now, but inside it's still empty. I've got my racing colors all picked out. I've got a decal on the bike, but empty engine cases. It's 1980 now. I've had the bike for 6 years and it's getting close to working. I still got those McKinney carburetors on it. I have dual pipes. I got the battery mounted right down here and behind the spoiler. That didn't work because the engine vibrated so much that the battery only lasted 150 miles. And see this? That little thing there? That's on the master cylinder. That's the anti-lock for the rear brake. Pretty trick, I must say. It's the other side of the bike, and I've got dual pipes here. Can you see that? They didn't last very long because when I started to ride it, they would scrape right here, so that was no good. I got a Norton front end and a disc brake. I thought that was pretty cool to have disc brakes on a vintage bike. It's now 1981. I've had the bike for 7 years. I had a friend up at Westwood. He was the caretaker there, and he let me come up and try and do some laps, but I still got the McKinney carburetors and we could not get the bike to run properly, so I can't say that was successful. Now we're up to 1982. I've got Amel carburetors on the bike. I've got stainless steel oil lines. I thought that was pretty cool. And you see here, that's a chain tensioner, because what I've done is I've raised up the motor and I didn't relocate the swing arm a pivot right there. So what happened was the chain got a whole lot of slack. So I made a tensioner. I've got a roller skate wheel here, and I've got a spring off a Kickstarter. But the chain still flopped up and down, and in a couple hundred miles, that chain was completely worn out. So I knew that I had to do something with the swing arm pivot. So this is also 1982, and I put some miles on this bike. I put maybe 400 to 500 miles on the bike. Have you noticed that I've changed the pipes as well? I've got rid of the 2 pipes. I've got a 2-into-1 system now, and I did put a few hundred miles on it, but I realized all the problems that the bike was having because it was raised up too much and the pivot was in the wrong location. So time to make some changes. On this photo here, I'm showing you this because I want you to notice the size of the workshop that I have. This was in the basement. These are the stairs that come down from upstairs in the kitchen. And this is where Vincent was. It sat over here, next to the stairs. I got a friend, his name is Gord E. McCord. He's a photographer. We met in the early 80s when we were both cab drivers. And he shot this photo of me. I don't know what that look is on my face, but here's the bike, and the stairs are on the left. This is the wall, that's the furnace, and that's my workbench, and I had very few tools at the time, but I was building a custom motorcycle. It's now 1983. I've got some forks. I've taken off the Norton forks because I got some fancier ones off a Suzuki 1100. I've mounted a fork brace because at that time you needed a fork brace. I've got the rear subframe made, and I've lowered the pivot for the swing arm. I have a hijacker air shock off a car, which never worked at all. And the Amel carbs are replaced by S&W Blue Magnums. That's these carbs. It's a copy of Electron. And I thought I would give those a go. And in hindsight, they were kind of hit and miss too. I was experimenting with shapes, so I took some cardboard and I made up a pattern. At this point, I think my illusions of going vintage road racing was sort of over, so my focus now was to make a road sled, something that I could ride on the street and actually get some miles out of. Here's a close-up of the engine. What you're looking at here is a reed valve breather for the crankcase. I found some reed valves off a 2-stroke. I made up a housing. And you're also looking at a Suzuki 750 alternator here. This is This is where the generator used to sit, but I've made a jack shaft and I got a pulley and belts, but that was never used. That didn't work out. There wasn't enough space in here. It's a close-up of the electrics module. I've got the battery, I've got the air horn. I decided I had to have an air horn. That was a rectifier, but I made it and it never got used either. It went in the bin. A few years have passed. I got involved in the bicycle business. I got pretty busy running Brodie bikes, but back to working on the Vincent now. And this is a rear shock absorber off a Honda motocrosser. It's a CR250 shock. And I realized that if I extended it, this is the extension, that I could make it work on my bike because the hijacker sure wasn't going to work. It's now 1992, and for the bicycle people watching, you can see all the rock roosters and the brake boosters in the background here. And I've swapped out the wheels. I've got some 600 Honda Hurricane wheels. They are 17-inch. So to swap out the wheels meant I had to make a couple new triple clamps, and I also had to make new mounts for the brake calipers on the front. And because the wheel size had changed, that meant the sprocket was now too big, so I had to make a new carrier for the sprocket. It's 1993 and the front end is looking really good, but what that did was to make the back end look pretty bad. So I was using a modified swing arm off of Kawasaki, so that had to go. And the subframe that I had on the back was made out of mild steel and it was brazed, but now I was using chromoly and I was TIG welding, so that meant making a whole new rear end for the bike. Here's the pieces for the new swing arm. It's 4130 and I'm all set to make it work. This is what it looks like when it's tacked up. I was going to use eccentrics on the back for the axle adjustment. I'd always wanted eccentrics. I thought it's cool. You can raise and lower the ride height depending on where you put the axle. They turned out to be a pain in the ass. I will never use eccentrics again. Okay, I got the swing arm upside down. This actually goes on the bottom. I'm checking for the clearance of the chain, make sure that I got enough space, and that was all fine. I'm checking the swing arm in place on the bike. That's looking good too right now. I made a sheet metal brace. I had a die. I punched a hole. I like the look of that. Vincent's looking better now. Got more pieces on it. So it's time to mount the rear shock absorber. And that's going to go from here to here. This is the shock absorber mount at the top. This is the Vincent oil tank here. And this is one of the few parts that I made and actually kept using. I started with a block of cold rolled steel. That's this piece here, and I started to make the shock mount. There's the shock mount. It's not brazed on yet, but I have to figure out the ride height next. So I've got a ruler. I'm figuring out the ride height, and if you look at the shock extension, you've noticed that I've changed that as well. So I guess I did some thinking about it, and I decided to change the geometry of how the shock works in relation to the rear wheel travel. On this shot here, you can see how I was trying to mount another Suzuki alternator, because a Vincent is 6 volts, so everyone wants a 12 volt system to be modern, and this is the jack shaft, and I tried to make it work, but ultimately that didn't work either. In the shop at the time, in the bicycle shop, we had a CNC machine, so I got Scott to help me, and these were the foot peg holders and other parts for the bike as well. So Vincent was getting some CNC. Here's the foot peg plates, and there's a shaft going right through, because what I wanted to do, I wanted to have shifting on the left side and Vincent shifts on the right, so I was adding complexity. I realize now that I should have just learned at that point in time how to shift on the right. This is how it all fits together, but it's not on the bike yet. These foot pegs are off a GSXR 750. That's it on the bike. Everything's assembled. I've got a master cylinder off a Suzuki 750. I seem to be using at this time a lot of Suzuki parts for some reason. Here's a collection of parts that I made for the Vincent that never got used. So you can see there's quite a few parts there. It's now 1994 and Vincent is almost done. It needs the body work and things like that, but basically mechanically it's almost all there. This is the shop where we used to make all the Brodie frames. It's 20 years that I've had the bike now and I've put 500 miles on it, and I was getting a lot of flack for some people, especially my grandmother. I think she was close to 90 and she said to me, "You'll never ride that thing." So that made me even more determined. I got to know a guy, I'm not going to mention any names, and he did a lot of really nice stuff on cars. He would make all sorts of panels, hoods, whatever. So he wanted a mountain bike, so we made a deal. He got a hand-built mountain bike and he was going to make me a gas tank and some fenders. This is the, I call it a buck, and then he forms the sheet metal so it fits onto the buck. So eventually, it took a long time, eventually I got a tank, but when I got the tank, it was all twisted. It was ridiculous. So then he took it back, he cut it all apart, and then the phone calls went on for weeks, months. And after a year of this, I decided that this deal is not happening. So I decided that I was going to make my own gas tank and seat out of fiberglass. In the meantime, I wanted to put a couple miles on the bike up and down the block anyway, so I made a little gas tank. It's all aluminum, it's custom, and I did go up and down the block using this gas tank. And through some connections, I ended up with a carbon fiber exhaust, so that got mounted as well. This is the third exhaust system, I believe, at that point, and there would be one more. I had to mount the rear caliper for the rear brake, so Scott did some CNC machining and I finished it off in the manual mill, same mill I have now. And that's what it looks like on the bike. This is the swing arm, eccentrics for the axle, and there's the caliper. It's still 1995. There's lots going on with Vincent. I have a focus. We're getting ready for assembly here. I was working at the shop in Richmond and I was separated from my wife and I was actually living upstairs. So I decided that I was gonna work for 60 days straight from morning to night and get this Vincent finished once and for all. So that was 1996 and I started on the 1st of March and my deadline was April 30th. So you can see here, I'm working on some parts. That's my dog Amber and we've got a moon. I'm working at night. I'm making a Fender Mold, and so I took some metal and I made up a form. I used a lot of Bondo and a lot of coarse sandpaper. So there are the plugs, and over the plugs I need to make the molds. I had some Imron paint and it was purple. I think it was purple metallic, and that's what I used. These are the molds that have been made over the plugs. The plugs are mounted onto plywood. And that's when I had a disaster. I could not separate the plugs from the mold. It was my mistake. I sanded with the wrong cloth, and even though I waxed and did everything else right, they would not separate. It was a big learning lesson. Here I am removing and destroying these plugs. That was a lot of work. I finally have my molds. This is about 5 days later. I really lost a lot of time in dicking around with these molds and the plugs. So a few days later, I'm back on track. I now have to make the shapes for the fairing and the seat and the tank. So I'm trying a new technique for me. This is plastic welding rod held by a glue gun. It means you can alter the shape pretty easy, and I like that process now. Starting to work on the tail section and the tank. I also need to make a pattern for the inside of the tank, or the floor of the tank, and it has to go around the cable routing of the carburetor, for example. So I had to figure all that out. I call this the whale tail because it kind of reminds me of a whale tail. So it's coming along. Here's a close-up. I got a new system for electrics. A McDougalator. There was a guy named John McDougall. He's since passed away, but he would make a conversion off a Kubota tractor, and so I ended up with one of those. That's where it sits right there. I put masking tape all over the plastic welding rod and then I fiberglassed over top of that. That's what makes the shape hard, rigid, and then I can do stuff with it. I did a lot of sanding. You can see all the dust. That Bondo dust just goes everywhere, and you can see once again I'm working at night. There's the plug. It's all finished. It's all painted and waxed, ready to make the mold. And that's the shape of the inside of the tank. You can see here that I've actually welded a mount onto the Vincent oil tank. Sacrilege. I've fiberglassed over that shape, so that's the final part. As a finishing touch, I took some carbon fiber weave and I laid it over top so that when you look inside the gas tank, you think that it's a carbon fiber tank. Because you know how often people look inside gas tanks, right? This is the mold, and it's basically done. That's the bottom and a bunch of other pieces ready for assembly. It's cause for celebration. This was a big moment to get this all done. There's a bunch of hardware that has to get mounted into the tank. I got the filler cap over here, mounts. This is rubber, fuel petcocks. It's April 30th, 1996. It's my deadline. And I say that I got the bike finished because I went for a ride to Iona Beach, which is not that far, but I actually put the bike on the road with a license plate and rode it. So my co-worker Chris, he says, no, you didn't finish the bike. You didn't paint it. So I say that I finished it. He said that I didn't. I felt like I met my deadline. In May of 1996, there was a Vincent rally up at Mara Lake in the Okanagan, so I loaded up my bike with my camping stuff and all that. What I have to mention here is that this bike has no Kickstarter because I haven't figured out how to make a Kickstarter look good on this bike. The stock one looks out of place. So everywhere I went, I had to bump start the bike. So I made it up to Mara Lake. That was a success. I almost made it home, and when I got almost to the Portman Bridge, that's when some loud noises came out of the crankcase. So I pulled into a little stop off the road, and a friend came by and we got the bike to the shop in his pickup truck, and I took the transmission all apart and the primary drive and the clutch because there was a bunch of problems going on. What problems I had on the bike? The front spark plug kept fouling. In 6400K that I rode, I used up 11 spark plugs. I had the transmission apart 3 times. The clutch gave me all sorts of problems. It's a complex clutch, and if the English can make something more complicated, they will. The primary drivetrain gave me trouble. It had to be replaced. The camshafts, the push rods, and the oil slinger. Those are the issues that I had with the Vincent. You can see bits all over the floor. Didn't have a proper work stand in those days. Myself and some friends, we decided that we were going to go to California on our bikes. And so other friends told me I was crazy to go on such an old bike, seeing as I'd have a lot of problems. But I decided that we should all go anyway. So here we are. There's me on the Vincent. There's Scott. He's got a Suzuki 750. There's Megan. She's on a Honda 550. And there's Harvey. He's on a Yamaha RD 350 LC, and I want you to note that he's got his lawn chair on the back. So anyway, we're ready to ride. That's us out on the road. We're heading to California somewhere. Actually, we're heading down to the Salsa Party, Ross Schaefer's annual Salsa Party. That was our destination. On the 3rd day, we were camping. And we woke up in the morning and it was pouring rain, and we said, let's just wait a bit, see if it clears up. Well, it never did, so we all put on our rain gear and we headed out into the rain, and we rode all morning in the rain. We stopped at a restaurant, and there was a lot of discussion from some of the party that they thought that we should rent a U-Haul truck to go to for the rest of the trip to go to California, but I didn't want to do that, so we kept riding a little bit, and then the sun came out, so we stopped beside the road and we dried out, and that's Megan sitting in Harvey's lawn chair beside the road. While I was driving down the road, I had a lot of time to think about the bike, and I decided that I wanted a new set of carburetors and a new set of exhaust pipes, because I thought that would really help the performance of the bike. Not to make it faster, just to make it run better. So first thing I did when I got home was to order a set of McKinney flat slides, 32 millimeters, and here I am making up new mounts. Once again, this will be the 4th set of carburetors on Vincent. And that's what they look like when they're mounted. I also made up a new set of header pipes, and I did something I thought was kind of cool. This is a trombone section here. This is a U-bend, so each pipe is the same length, and I can move this one back and forth a little bit to make it longer or shorter. That was the tuning part of it, and I was happy with that. I did a motorcycle show. That was my very first motorcycle show on my own, and the night before the show I painted these pipes because they were kind of rusty. You saw the last photo. I painted them this bright orange, and when people stopped by the booth, I would tell them that I got the paint from NASA. I had a friend smuggle it across the border, and it was super high heat for 1200 degrees or whatever like that, and people would just nod their heads and say, oh yeah. So a little bit of BS, but I was having some fun. Of course, when I started to ride the bike, all the paint burnt off and I had to get them chrome plated. I couldn't leave anything alone. I always had to modify. So here I've got a pair of Yamaha upside down forks. And so, of course, those got mounted onto Vincent. This is the last photo that I have of Vincent. So this would have been 1998, something like that. And you can see that the seat in the tank is painted. I've made a new fairing. I've got 2 small halogen headlights in here. I've got the upside down forks on, and still no Kickstarter. Amazing. I sold the bike in 1999. In 1976, I bought shares in the Vincent Spares Company because that seemed like a good idea at the time. I still have this piece of paper. I have no idea if the shares are worth anything at all. If you're a Vincent owner, you know that Vincents have their own little newspaper or magazine, whatever you want to call it. So my bike made the cover in September of 1997, which is quite amazing because it's completely non-standard. Looking back now, hopefully using a little bit of hindsight, what do I think of this project? I would classify it as a learning experience because I didn't do a lot of riding on it. I sure did a lot of work on it. So I was learning about engineering, fabrication, relationship in between parts, metallurgy, things like that, and packaging as well, because what I learned is that when you move one part, it often affects 3, 4, 5 other parts. So you really have to think about the cohesiveness of the whole thing. And that's not easy to do, and that's probably why I made so many parts. I made parts and then didn't use them, made a better part, because I was always thinking about the process and how to improve upon it. So I would call it my education. Thank you for watching our video. I hope that you have enjoyed it. Hopefully learned a little something. Mitch and I both like coffee. If you would like to buy us a coffee, we thank you. See you next week. Stay safe.